Thanks for checking out my channel. I'm happy to have you here. Please subscribe, also hit the like button. I hope you like my voice, it's the only one I have right now. Well, I will switch from man to woman voice here and there. Thanks again. I have set up a Patreon account, so you very special people who likes my stuff can keep on getting my videos. I think it's only $1 a month and up. Thanks again, and now the stories you've been waiting for. Posted by user Uncommon and Sensesm. Abusive teacher. This is long, so sorry in advance. This happened back in the 80s, when I was in 4th grade, in a smallish city in southwestern Ontario, Canada, about an hour from London and 50 minutes from Waterloo. I have exceptional autobiographical memory, which is often mislabeled as photographic memory, so I don't forget anything that happens to me. Decades on, these memories are still all too fresh. Admittedly, I wasn't the easiest girl to have in class, as I was, at that point, undiagnosed, ADHD, high-functioning autistic, and dealing with dyscalculia, a math-based learning disability similar to dyslexia. In some subjects, I was very advanced, but in anything to do with numbers, I was below grade level and struggling terribly. I wasn't disruptive or full of attitude in class though. Instead, I was the shy, quiet sort of kid who just wanted to be invisible, unnoticed. I retreated into my own personal world of imagination when stressed or bored or scared, quietly rocking back and forth in my seat. I knew during the very first day of school that my 4th grade teacher didn't like me. I hadn't done anything to attract Mr. K.'s dislike other than be different, be the social misfit I unfortunately was. Within the first week, he was referring to me in a snide, sarcastic manner, calling on me over and over in math to answer questions despite my never putting up my hand to volunteer an answer, and then belittling me in front of the whole class when I got it inevitably wrong, and yelling at me whenever I indulged in the autistic behaviors that helped settle my overwhelmed nervous system, the rocking, hand flapping, hand wringing, and hair twirling that autistics so often do. These are useful things for autistics, as they help us manage stress and calm us down. Of course, at that point I didn't have a formal diagnosis, in part due to my parents' denial. My mother was a teacher in the same school district, and there was a sort of unspoken rule that a teacher's kid had to be perfect, couldn't have learning disorders or neurological differences. The snide comments, belittling, and yelling progressed into hitting my desk with the blackboard pointer or meter stick, yardstick, for you Americans a long wooden ruler, and then hitting me with these things, usually across the back or buttocks, and always in front of the whole class. He threw things at me sometimes too. Then, he moved my desk to the far back corner of the room, where I could not see the blackboard due to a vision impairment. Another time, he picked up my desk, turned it upside down so the contents spilled out, and looked like he was going to throw it at me, but another student made a shocked little cry and he reluctantly set it back down and growled at me to pick that shit up, referring to the books and papers and pencils that he had dumped out of my desk. I began to notice that I was not the only victim of his bullying and abuse. There were a few other kids, also those who were different in some manner, who attracted his undeserved ire. One was a boy who was very, very gifted, Ian. One was a girl who was also ADHD and at the lower end of intellectually average, Kim, who was my best friend. One was Mike, a boy who was half native Canadian who also had quite a severe weight problem and dyslexia, who became a very close friend to me, so much so that we ended up dating in our 20s. One was Marcy, who was also a bit intellectually slow and whose single mother was on welfare, something rather scandalous back then. We were the class misfits, the unpopular kids. We banded together to try to help each other endure. We even devised a written code with which to pass notes to each other without him being able to read them, and if one of us got in trouble and got detention, another of us would intentionally get detention so that none of us had to be alone with him. If we were alone with him, that was when the abuse really got bad. The yelling, screaming, belittling, name-calling, and sarcasm became extreme, and he smacked us, punched us, and hit us with the meter stick. Yes, we did tell our parents. But there had been an issue the year before where two girls who had gotten into trouble had falsely accused the school's principal of sexual abuse. They both fully admitted that they made it up to get out of trouble, and both of those girls were in my class that year, so our parents assumed that we were doing the very same thing, not able to give credence to what sounded to them like abuse so extreme that it had to be made up. Also, my mother was a teacher in the same school board, so she was afraid of reporting him. She thought she might even lose her job over it, and that destroyed the trust and respect I had for her for many years, making our relationship terrible, strained, and rife with upset, so she said nothing to anyone who might have been able to stop Mr. KM from abusing us and other kids. Still, she did press for me to get testing done, and it came out that I had been diagnosed as autistic back in nursery school, but my parents had been in denial and never informed the school board. That left me with no supports or protections. The new testing found the blazingly obvious ADHD and the dyscalculia and refined my autism diagnosis. Finally, I thought, things would change. No teacher would knowingly abuse a kid with disabilities, right? Right? Well, no. Nothing changed. Mr. KM was as abusive as ever. The only difference was that I was sent to the resource room for math, with Mrs. I. She taught the students who needed special help and remedial classes. She was lovely, and such a welcome respite from Mr. KM. We moved to a new school ward on the other side of town that December. Unfortunately, my mother chose to leave me in that class instead of moving me to my new school that year. She thought I would have trouble socially with being the new kid arriving long after the new class's social groups had formed. Meanwhile, I was hiding the bruises from daily beatings with the blackboard pointer or meter stick, deeply anxious and depressed, angrily wishing I could kill Mr. KM, as I thought that was the only way the abuse would stop. I was only 9, and I was suicidal. If it hadn't been for Mike, Kim, Ian, and Marcy, I doubt I would have gotten through it alive. We stood up for each other, helped each other, cried for each other. We even loved each other, I think. We were brothers and sisters in abuse, even if there was no genetic tie between us. Finally, the school year ended. I began fresh at a new school on the other side of town. I kept in contact with the ragtag little band of friends I had made in 4th grade, and spoke to others who had gone to that school as I got older. I discovered that Mr. K.M.'s picking 4 to 5 kids out of each year's class to abuse was a long-standing habit. He did it year after year. What more, the other teachers knew about it, hearing his screaming tirades, the unexplained crashes from his classroom, and the crying of students, and they said nothing. You'd think it would end there, wouldn't you? Nope. I eventually had it out with Mr. KM. As part of a high school careers program, I ended up working as a co-op student in the school where I had been abused, where Mr. KM was still teaching. I worked as a teacher's aide for a class of students with special needs. I loved my students, and I would have cheerfully adopted any of them if I had been asked to. Awesome kids! The kids in the class I served got their buses half an hour before the regular classes were dismissed, and I was always the one to help them out to the buses with their wheelchairs and walkers. One day, the driver of one of the special needs buses asked me to relay a message to another teacher, so I had to go up to the second floor, to that teacher's room. At this point, the students in the regular classes were getting ready for dismissal. Getting their hats, mitts, boots, and coats on. I came upon Mr. KM screaming at one of his little second graders, with his fists around her upper arms, shaking her so hard her head was being jerked back and forth so hard that I was afraid she'd get whiplash or that he might even break her neck. I lost my temper. I ran over to them and shoved him away from the poor little girl. I then pushed him hard against the wall and pinned him there, my hands around his throat and my knee firmly planted in a place that is especially painful to men. I was squeezing his throat hard, and he couldn't scream. His hands beat at me but I refused to let go. At this point, I was 16, was just as tall as he was, and very strong from my figure skating. He was nearing retirement and was physically quite weak. He couldn't effectively fight back. I told him that I remembered everything he did to me and the other 4 abused kids in my class. I told him that I knew he did that every year. I said that if I even heard the vaguest of rumors that he was still being cruel and abusive to any more kids, I would tell the school board, the police, and the media. I told him that I would make sure he left teaching in public disgrace and then sue him into spending his retirement years living in a cardboard box. I swore I would ruin him, destroy his reputation, hopefully see him jailed, and ensure he was as publicly hated as he deserved to be. Then, I dropped him on the floor. He was gasping, coughing, and gagging over the grip I'd had on his scrawny neck. I went over to the little girl, who was on the floor as well. She was a little sobbing heap. I gently picked her up and asked her if he had hurt her. She said yes, and I said go on down to the school nurse, and tell her that Mr. KM hurt you. You aren't in any trouble, I promise. I asked one of her friends to go with her, a friend that had seen the whole sad and sorry event. They left in the direction of the nurse's office. I looked back over at Mr. KM, who was starting to pick himself up off the floor tiles. He looked at me with an expression of absolute hate, but I could tell that there was fear behind it. I skewered him with my own stare. The kids in the hallway around us were silent, watching in shock. I then said to him, remember what I said. I'll take pleasure in ruining you. It'll be a fitting revenge for every kid you abused. He dropped his gaze then, and shuffled back into his classroom and closed the door. I knew I had beaten him. I knew I had him in a situation he couldn't fight. I then told his class to get ready and go home. They quickly gathered their things and left. He didn't come back out of his classroom, and I went to deliver the bus driver's message to the other teacher. Later, I found out that Mr. KM had gone to the principal that night after school and asked to take early retirement. As it was the middle of the school year, he wasn't allowed to. Instead, he began to suck up to me intensely. He held open doors for me, complimented me, tried to ingratiate himself constantly. It did him no good. I began calling him things like weasel and worm right to his face, and he couldn't do anything about it. The next year, he took that early retirement. He stopped teaching due to the threat I held over him. It made me feel powerful, victorious. It was closure on a year of hell, of lasting physical and emotional scars, of a loss of trust for my parents, of deep depression. I finally felt strong. He never did go back to teaching. I went on to graduate high school early and went off to university. Yes, there are still some issues between myself and Mum. Dad passed away 15 years ago, but we get along well enough, and we trust each other now. She lives with me now, as she has some medical problems now that she is quite elderly. Things are okay between us, and we have talked about it and put it to rest. As to why the other teachers said nothing about KM abusing kids. Well, it was a very different time. Students were not believed when they claimed they were being abused at school, and bullying was just seen as a rite of passage, something that had to be endured to make us stronger adults. Total BS. There was also a mentality that problems in the school community should be addressed only within the school community, not reported to the school board. No teacher wanted to be the one to ruin another teacher's career, even if that teacher was an abusive bastard like KM. It really was a very different time, especially in small, rural cities like mine. 16 comments. Post by user, Witch. Watching me on the baby monitor. This just happened an hour or two ago and I'm pretty freaked out. Long time lurker, first time poster, on mobile, so I'll do my best with formatting, I'm sure you know the drill. 24-year-old female. So I have a Wi-Fi enabled baby monitor in my bedroom so we can watch my 5-month-old son when he's sleeping, in his bassinet when my husband and I are downstairs. I tend to be nude when in my bedroom, in the second story of my house. As I don't have central air and it's summer in Wisconsin, USA. And today is currently over 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Almost 27 degrees Celsius. I was laying in bed drinking a beer and watching TV, when I noticed the light blinking on the baby monitor, which was currently facing toward the bed, as my son had been in a co-sleeper on the bed with my husband last night. I work overnight shifts in a hospital. For our monitor, a light blinking on it means that someone is watching, via the website or app for the monitor. I jokingly sent a text calling my husband a creeper. I was flipping off the camera and talking to it, but found it odd that it took him several minutes to read my message. He is at work at this time. When he finally responded, I could say the cliché "my blood ran cold," but that would be embellishing. He said he hadn't opened the app for the camera in weeks and definitely wasn't the one watching, and advised that I unplug the camera, which I did. I don't know who was watching me, or how they could have gotten a hold of the login info for the monitor, but creepy person watching me through my baby monitor. Let's not meet. Ever. Posted by user Koi. Creepy school bus driver, let's not meet. As a third grader, I had this school bus driver, a seemingly normal country-looking white-haired Caucasian chubby dude with crystal blue eyes who seemed old to a third grader but was probably late 40s. He would constantly slam on the brakes, hard. And everyone's heads would crash into the back of the seat in front of us. To this day I remember the feeling and smell of being slammed into that musty green hard pleather seat face first. At first I thought it was just an accident, but he started doing it daily. Once I looked up at him, in that huge mirror thing, and he was staring directly at me, with this huge pervy smile on his face. It became obvious he was doing it on purpose, sometimes 3 to 4 times in a row, pumping the brakes from going pretty fast. Every time after I'd look up and he would be looking back at us all with that smile, but the one time I made direct eye contact with him afterwards will stick with me forever. I'd constantly go to school with a horrible headache and feeling nauseous because of it. Eventually we all learned to brace ourselves. We didn't have seat belts as far as I can remember, but would still end up hitting the seat pretty hard. So, guy who derived pleasure by purposely causing children pain, let's not meet. Posted by user JennyBean 2000. Creepy smelly guy grabbed me as a kid. Hey there. I've mostly been a lurker for most of my time on Reddit. I've posted a few times, not in this subreddit, but I have been reading a ton of posts here and decided to share this story about something that happened to me when I was younger. Some details are very vivid, others are fuzzy, but I'll try to make it as accurate as I can remember. When I was growing up, we lived in Baltimore City until I turned 12. This incident happened, I believe, when I was around 7 or 8. I don't remember exactly, but I know it was definitely before I turned 9 because my older brother left for boot camp and then later deployed when I was 9. Both my brother and mother were/are in the military, and he was still at home and not yet in the military when this happened. Also, I am mute. I was born with deformed vocal cords, which isn't super important, but it does affect the story somewhat. Our house was only 6 blocks from my school, and I would walk home by myself on some days. Sometimes my brother would meet me at my school and walk me home, but he played football and baseball and sometimes would be at his school for practice. My mother worked 12-hour shifts as a nurse, so some days she would pick me up, others she wouldn't. Of course she wasn't too keen on me walking home, but me being a stupid and naive kid had nagged her enough to where she finally let me walk home on those days instead of taking the bus. It was only 6 blocks, and again, being a kid, it made me feel mature and responsible. I know, stupid me. My mom had always been worried about predators, like most parents are, but she worried that me being mute would make me an easier target since I can't scream. I do always carry a whistle around my neck, and the importance of stranger danger had been drilled into me by my mom. She had also had me learning self-defense since I was 4, but again, I was only 7 or 8 at the time and I hadn't exactly mastered any of these skills. On the day of this event, I was walking home by myself. I was a very lonely kid who didn't have any friends. I'm not announcing that for pity or anything, just to help you understand why I was alone. I usually did a pretty good job of being mindful of my surroundings, but again I was a kid and my mind would sometimes wander and daydream like any other normal kid. I was about halfway home when it happened. I was passing by a narrow alleyway and out of nowhere, I felt myself grabbed very roughly from behind. I felt my body just freeze up in panic. One thing I remember very vividly was the odor. This guy smelled terrible. Just awful BO, like nasty old gym socks that you left in the bottom of your locker and forgot about them until the end of the school year or something. I could feel his hot, horrible breath against the back of my head and neck. He was breathing heavy, like a dog does when it's hot out. He didn't say a word. I just remember his arms wrapped so tightly around me. Looking back now, I realize he must have been watching me for a while because he never tried to cover my mouth. He must have known that I was mute. Even though it was just a few seconds, it felt like time slowed. I couldn't move. Like my brain just wouldn't tell my body to move or something. I remember seeing the sidewalk get further away as he pulled me back into the alley. Finally, my body woke the hell up and I started flailing as hard as I could. I don't know if he was actually strong or if it was just because of my age, but his grip felt like it was going to crush me. I kept trying to reach my hand up to grab my whistle and try to get it in my mouth, but my arms were pinned at my sides with his arms around me. I was kicking my legs as hard as I could. I felt so helpless. No matter how hard I tried, I could not break free, not even a little bit. I remember a thought flashing in my head that this was the kind of thing my mom and teachers had always warned us about. It made me even more scared. I tried kicking my heels back into him, hoping maybe I'd get lucky and nail a shin or something. No such luck. It just made him squeeze me tighter. He was squeezing so tight I could barely breathe. I guess it was the combination of being squeezed like that and the fear of what was happening, but I started feeling dizzy and faint. That was the most terrifying moment because I felt like if everything went black that I'd never wake up again. My head was starting to droop down and I could feel myself getting very weak. From out on the street, I heard a loud "Hey! What the fuck?" and I managed to raise my eyes up and saw two figures running toward us and yelling. The guy holding me immediately let me go. I had been up in the air and kinda landed on the concrete in a heap, gasping. I was shaking so hard. My backpack felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I could hear the footsteps of the two people running toward us, and the footsteps of the other guy running away down the other side of the alley. I could feel one of them tear past me. I felt the breeze as he passed, and even heard the sound of it in my ear. The other person must have not wanted to leave me there and stopped. I was still in this daze, a little dizzy and in some kind of shock, I guess. I felt their hand touch my shoulder and ask if I was okay. This jolted me out of the daze and I just bolted. I didn't look at them or anything. I just took off out of the alleyway and sprinted to our house. I got inside, locked the door and just collapsed into a ball in the foyer. All my emotions caught up with me then and I just sobbed and sobbed. I laid there for what felt like forever. I was still there when my brother came in from practice. I was still very visibly upset and he immediately wanted to know what was wrong. I explained what happened, though I'm sure it was not nearly as coherent as the way I'm telling you now since I was still extremely shook up. He called the police immediately and then my mom. My brother was a decently sized guy and I'm sure he wanted to hunt the smelly guy down, but he sat on the steps with me in his lap until the police came. The police in that area don't exactly have the best response time, but they actually arrived fairly quickly. My mom got there shortly after they did, of course out of her mind with worry and anger. My brother and mom helped me relay to the police what happened. I communicate through ASL and they translated to the police for me. Since I couldn't give a description, I never actually saw the guy. They said they'd be on the lookout for anyone acting suspicious, but the chances of finding him were extremely slim. However, it turns out the two guys that ran into the alley to help me had called the police as well and were able to give somewhat of a description, though apparently the guy had on a knit cap with a hood up as well, so unless he was wearing the same clothes, he would be hard to find. To be honest, I don't think the police really took it that seriously overall, since Baltimore is a pretty dangerous place and way worse crimes happen there constantly. They gave me the whole "be more careful from now on" speech and left. My mom and brother checked in with them pretty regularly for quite a while, but they never found the guy. Needless to say, my mom definitely didn't let me walk home by myself anymore. I began taking the bus, which would drop me off right at our house, and my brother worked it out with his coaches that he could be home when I got home. We ended up moving to Washington State a few years later when I was 12, and I only go back to Baltimore once every year or so to visit my grandparents, though I never went back to our old neighborhood again. I hate to think what would have happened to me had those two guys not ran into the alley after me. Thank you to those guys, and to the crazy smelly guy that tried to kidnap me. Please, let's not ever meet again. Posted by Use Me Us Everyone. Today took me back to being 8 years old. So I was walking through the town center with my husband. We was just talking about what bills needed paying etc. I looked over from me, and straight in front of me was a man. This was no ordinary man, this was a man whose face is etched in my brain, in my memory. A memory I locked away many years ago. When I was around 8, my aunt, who had a few learning disabilities, lived on her own. She was not very clean, lived in a 1-bedroom flat with around 5 cats. It stunk, it was dirty, but I used to go help her tidy up and look after the cats. There was a man who lived in the upstairs flat, we will call him C. C also had cats, and his cats had kittens. C had befriended my aunt and used to come talk to her. They seemed like good friends, but I didn't like him too much. One day while I was there, C turned up. He had been up feeding kittens for most of the night. As the mum cat was rejecting them, he said he was tired, and if he fell asleep to wake him in 2 hours to feed the kittens. 2 hours went by, and my aunt said we need to wake C so he can feed the kittens. My aunt tried to wake him, shaking him. All he did was grumble and say, "Fuck off, get away from me, I'm sleeping." My aunt started to laugh, thinking he was joking, and started pulling at his foot. She hit down on his foot and shouted, "See, you need to get up and go feed your kittens." All of a sudden he jumps up, no emotion in his face, looked straight towards me and started to march my way across the room. I tried to run for the door, but he managed to catch me around my neck. His hands went tighter and tighter. I wanted to scream and cry, I wanted my mum. I thought I was going to die as he raised me off the floor with his hand still around my neck, slowly creeping up the wall. I was 8, around 56 pounds, so was not big at all, very petite. I could feel the life being drained from me. All of a sudden I felt my body sliding quickly down the wall. I felt a very sharp pain at the top of my leg where it meets your bum, and realized he had slammed me down on a radiator that was on the wall. With that he let go, straightened himself out and said, "I'm going to feed the kittens." He left. I was crying so hard I just wanted my mum. My aunt was just stood there, mouth open. She didn't try to help, just stood there screaming while he did it. Funny thing is, I know she was screaming, but in that few minutes that it took to happen, it was like silence for me, pure silence. All I remember is just looking in C's eyes, thinking I'm never going to see my mum or brothers and sisters again. My aunt rang my mum. She caught a taxi straight to her house. My stepdad came and went to find C. He had disappeared. No one knew where he was. For 2 weeks my stepdad waited outside the flats, but he didn't come back. Some cat protective people came and got the cats and kittens and took them away. The police tired up as my mum was ringing them as a neighbor had heard the commotion and rang them. They took statements and took us home. I also had to have photos taken of my injuries around my neck and just under my bum, where I had a big gash from the side of the radiator. I had to have it dressed by a nurse for a while, but it was okay, just left a scar. C went to court and luckily I didn't have to attend because of my age. All he got was 1 year conditional discharge. I was told this means if he did anything within a year he would have this charge to put onto whatever the charge was. That was not justice, it was a joke. I was scared to leave my home, didn't want to play out with friends. My aunt went on to not talk to the family and marry that man, only lasted 6 months. I wanted so much to wreck the wedding. I hated him, her, them. I hated them to the point I cried. Why should they be happy when they stole my light? My light was now dark, it divided a lot of the family. It took a long time for nightmares to stop and the anxiety he was going to come finish what he started. I put it away in a box, never wanting to open it again. And there he was, stood right in front of me, there, right there. I wanted to go slap him, beat him, but also wanted my husband to just hug me tight and tell me I was okay. As I looked back, he looked at me, but I don't even think he knew who I was. But I certainly knew who he was. As quick as I saw him, he was gone. I stewed on my feelings for a few days, but think it's time to put them back in the box where they belong. So to this vile person of a human called C, please let's never meet again. Posted by user TomGirl17. The man in black has returned. So some background information. I ride my bike a lot, well used to, but picked it back up again. Anyway, the first encounter was 2 years ago when I worked at a Brahms. I usually work till about 10 at night. The thing is, there are usually only lights at the first part of the commute and entrances to each neighborhood. I always wear an orange vest. I have a light on the front and a flashing light on the back of my bike. The first encounter with this man was when I saw a black figure in the distance, and he was, from what I could see, it looked like he was wearing a tuxedo or business suit of some kind, but I couldn't see his face. It was too dark even with my light on. We were a good distance away, but close enough to see each other's figures at least. I stopped my bike and waited. We were out there for a good 10 to 15 minutes, staring at each other. I, being 17 at the time, was too scared to move and couldn't think straight. At some point he decided to continue walking towards me, and I decided to go diagonal towards the street and pedal as fast as possible. I ended up avoiding him getting close to me. Now the second encounter was the next week on the same day, except I was coming back from a game store I normally go to. This time he was standing under the bridge I normally go under to avoid crossing the street. Again, I couldn't see his face because there were no lights under the bridge. So instead of standing and staring like last time, I back up and head towards the crosswalk because it's busy there and people can see me. I make sure I don't see anyone making their way out from the bridge both behind and in front of me. I don't see him, so I make a break for it so fast I nearly fell off my bike. I make sure I'm not being followed this time because last time I was so scared I only really looked back once. I don't see him again for the next 2 years. For some reason it was weird. Third encounter, I hung out with some friends, got a ride back to the game shop where my bike was. It was about 2:30 in the morning. I had enough nighttime biking that I wasn't really scared of biking that early/late at night/morning. This night though was extremely scary. Not only did two of the lamp posts turn off when I passed by them, which startled me, I then see the man in black waiting at the top from under the bridge. I am going too fast to turn around, my heart pounding so hard I felt like I was about to die of a heart attack. I sped up thinking surely he won't try to do anything while I'm going fast, he will get hit too. So I move over to the right as much as I can, and as I pass him all I see is a big wide creepy smile. I was so scared I couldn't be more happier to get home. However, I was so scared I left my bike on the porch, not even locking it up, and instantly used my key to get back into the house. I may stop riding my bike again, well, at least for nights. I honestly hope I never meet him again, and just hope that if he was trying to do something he will give up after seeing me gone for a while. Posted by user Shamduan. Never open the door for a stranger. So this happened around 8 years ago or so. My husband and I were in Bangalore, India. We were staying at a nice hotel in a very high-profile area. Lots of shopping malls, hotels, etc. We've been to a lot of countries, and by far, we've never met such unfriendly staff at any other place. I don't mean to shade Indians at all, but it's just my experience. Not even a single smile. Not even from the receptionists. It's simply rude to stare. Everywhere we go, we get stared at by locals. I dress very modest, but I'm obviously not a local. But during our stay, we had kinda got used to it. One night, after a lot of shopping and walking around, we came back to the hotel. We decided to enter through the back entrance since it was near. Through the back entrance there was a huge statue of one of their gods. Next to it was a pub. It was kind of late too. We saw a lot of staff hanging around the pub. Probably they were off duty and were clearly drunk. As usual, they stared a lot. We ignored and went to our room. After some time my husband decided he was hungry and wanted to get something to eat. The hotel restaurant was already closed. I wasn't hungry since we had something at a coffee shop a little earlier. So he said he would go to another hotel nearby that had a 24-hour restaurant, get food, and come back to eat ASAP. I was too tired by now to accompany him. So I told him I would like to rest. He leaves and now I'm in just my undies, relaxing, watching TV. Just a few minutes after my husband left, there was a knock on the door. Now my husband had the key card. He wouldn't need to knock. Plus he knocks different. I didn't answer the door. There were no peepholes to check who was on the other side. So I just lay on the bed, ignoring. Whoever it was, knocked quite a lot. I decided just ignore until my husband came back. Mostly I was too lazy to get dressed. Knocking stopped and a few minutes later the hotel phone rang. I answered and there was a guy. He asked me if my husband was there. I told him no. He told me he was staying in another room of this floor and thus was our neighbor. Told me he ran out of water and asked if I had water. I sensed he was trying to find a way to get me open the door. So I told him no. I don't have water either and hung up. A few minutes later there was a lot more knocking. Since this was 8 years ago, I was pretty young and naive too. Hardly knew what to do. So just decided to ignore. Knocking stopped and the phone rang again. There was a woman this time. She didn't know what to say. Clearly there were people behind her telling her what to say. She was hesitating and I heard other voices. She soon hung up. There was more knocking again for some time. But I still ignored. So it stopped. I think they gave up trying to enter my room. Some time later my husband came back, later than expected. I told him what happened and oh my God was he furious. He wanted to know who was trying to get into the room. So he locked me in the room again and went downstairs and questioned at the reception. They did not know, of course. But they did not even try to find out. They told us there was no one else staying at our floor. My husband came upstairs and knocked at every freaking door on the floor, still furious. There was one other couple in another room who had no idea what had happened. When he came back to the room, he hugged me really tight and thanked me for not opening the door that night. We changed hotels the very next day and all we did was left them a bad review. So whoever was trying to get into my room that night, let's not meet. I suspect it was more than one guy too. Posted by Usmali Molotov 666. My let's not meet story. How my social anxiety may have saved my life. He was cute, and I was lonely. It's a bad combination. This happened a few years ago. After living in a new city for a few weeks, and feeling needy for sexual tension, I downloaded a hookup app, looking for a little strange. It's especially strange for me, because I am a loner. I purposely avoid people, but I had needs. I made a profile, and got a few matches. One was promising, in particular. Named Keller. We hit it off very well, and we made plans to meet. He was going to come to my place the next weekend. Something you need to know about me before I continue: I am extremely antisocial. I hate social interactions with people. After such a big move, it had only gotten worse. As the time got closer for us to meet, I went from being bubbly and excited, to colder and more reserved. He noticed and commented that I was being standoffish. It wasn't him, I swear. It was the social anxiety, but he refused to listen. That was when the red flags started. He started saying weird things like "you better not change your mind about meeting," and "you're acting like you're going to cancel. You need to talk to me first if you even think about canceling on me." I began answering his messages less and less as I tried to think of a way out of this. I didn't want to hurt or piss him off, but I wasn't feeling it like I had when we first met. He then started saying things like "you know you're wifey material, right? Record scratch. Last thing I wanted, or needed was someone to date. I just wanted sexy time, not that." I promptly told him I'm not interested anymore, and politely backed off. Too much, too quick, and far from what I wanted. My social anxiety was bad enough, but that sent me into overdrive. I stopped answering all messages. The messages didn't stop, and got weirder and weirder until I had to delete the app because he would say things like "oh, come on. No need to be unreasonable. I thought you were different." He got madder because I didn't answer. Said I should lose weight before I get confident enough to reject a guy, and called me every foul name he could think of. He even told me to kill myself. The message that made me block him and delete was "you're lucky you didn't piss me off like this face to face. I would have fucking ended you." I promptly deleted the app. Thank you, crippling social anxiety. For once, you were useful. And as for Keller, Let's not meet. Ever. Edit, don't be like me. Everything I did was not okay. I put myself in danger. Always meet in a public place first. Posted by Thea Flair. Stalked on our driveway. I know this may sound far-fetched, but hand on heart, this is a true story. I can totally understand if you don't believe me, as it sounds very unbelievable. However, I know what happened to me, and I for one just want people to know. Firstly, just some background information. I live in a relatively small town in the country. When I was younger, around 13 to 14, I used to be obsessed with anything secret related. I would spend hours looking up conspiracy theories, watching documentaries about foreign affairs, reading articles about secret wars. I would tell everything I learned to my friends and family, but all I would really get is a "that's nice" or "I doubted that ever happened" from them. No one seemed to be interested except for one friend of mine named Craig. We would hang out every now and then, and all we would talk about is conspiracies. Occasionally we would have a sleepover, and instead of playing video games or watching movies, we would get out our laptops and do as much research as we could. Writing down websites we deemed creepy and writing in notebooks filled with information we had gathered. It was quite the exciting for both of us. We felt like we knew things we weren't meant to know, and that gave us a rush. So, one night Craig was over at mine for a sleepover, and we were doing our usual secret work, and I came across this website deep within Google, on something like page 79 in the search engine. It had a list of Russian statesmen/politicians from a former branch of the Russian space program. I knew that because I recognized the Intercosmos symbol on the top left-hand corner of the page. The page was all in Russian, and I just randomly started clicking around. I eventually got to a page that looked like contact information. It had what looked like an email address at the bottom. So dumb naive me thought it would be a good idea to send them an email using my own personal email address. At the time my email was just my full name. I wrote an email consisting something along the lines of, "Hello, my name is Thea Flair, and I was just wondering if you would be willing to answer some questions I have about your space program." I then proceeded to list conspiracy theories about the Russian space program and demanding an answer from them. Me and Craig thought this was very clever, as we were hoping to at least get a response. Our heads, if they denied what we asked, then they were just covering up the evidence, and therefore we had real proof. To our surprise, the email actually sent. We thought it would have been unable to send due to how old we thought the email address was. Weeks pass and we eventually forget about the email. We just got along with our daily lives of going to school and doing dumb young teenage stuff. One weekend I was sitting at the dinner table with my family, and my sister started asking my father if he had any Russian friends. My father said no, but he had worked in Russian for a few years in the past. My sister goes on to say that her friend's mother was stopped in the street while walking home from work by two men with Russian accents in a dark green car. They asked if she knew where they could find my family's last name, house. My dad said that was weird and he would call my sister's friend's mom later. I immediately thought back to that email I had sent. My young head started spinning with ideas of spies trying to get to me and my family. I thought it was rather exciting. After dinner my father called my sister friend's mom and I listened in from upstairs. I couldn't really hear much out of my father's end of the conversation, but as soon as my father hung up, he called the family down to have a talk. He told us that what my sister said was true and he was worried that it may be some thieves trying to scope the house out. He told us to keep a lookout for a big dark green car with dark windows. If we saw something suspicious, we were to immediately find him and tell him. It was at this point I thought about tell my dad about the email, but I thought I would get in trouble, so I decided against it. The next day I was asked by my mother to take the trash out to the front to be collected tomorrow. We lived at the bottom of a long path in the countryside, so it takes about 5 minutes to walk up to the top of the driveway. As I was near the top of the path, I noticed a car parked up just off to the side of our driveway entrance, about 50 feet away. When I got closer, I realized was the same car my father had described to me. A dark green car with blacked out windows just sitting there. I pretended not to notice it and just dumped the trash. I turned around and got out my phone and called my dad's mobile. He picked up and I told him that the car he had described was at the top of the driveway. He told me to come back to the house and he would be straight out. I slowly started to walk back home, keeping the car in my peripheral vision. Not a minute later my dad was jogging up the drive and asked me where the car was. I turned around and pointed at it. He began to run up the drive towards the car. Suddenly the car's engines turned on and it peeled away at speed down the round. Stunned by what just happened, me and my dad just looked at each other. We both ran back home. He told me to promise not to tell my mother or sister as it may scare them. When we got back home, he took me into his home office, then he called the police. The police said there is not much they could do as they hadn't done anything illegal. But to call back if they kept showing up. Well, they did show up again. Every time it was me or my dad that would notice them and the same route would happen. One of us would see the car, try to get close or flag it down, it would speed off, call the police, then repeat. My mother even saw it once when coming home from shopping. The police eventually sent a car to patrol our area, but they never saw the dark green car. My dad was getting noticeable paranoid and even considered buying a rifle. This whole time I genuinely thought it was my fault and if I had never sent that email then none of this would happen. But I just didn't want to get in trouble. Once I got actually quite close to the car as it stalled while trying to drive off. I tried to read the license plate, but the car was side on to me. By the time I got any closer it was too far down the road. At that point I wasn't scared anymore, just angry, and I wanted the people in that car just to leave us alone. The worst part for me happened when I was alone at home. Both my mother and father were at work and my sister was at one of her after-school programs. My dad told me to keep the door locked at all times and if anything were to happen, to call the police. I was watching TV in the living room when I heard the gravel in our driveway move. This was the distinctive sound of a car coming down the driveway. I got up to see which one of my parents was home from work. But it wasn't either of them. The dark green car was now in the driveway. I felt so helpless and scared. It just stayed parked there, engine still running. I jumped up to grab the home phone. But as soon as I got up the car turned around and drove out. I immediately called my dad. He told me he would be home soon and just to keep the door locked. When he got home, I told him what happened. He didn't see the car when driving back, but again he called the police. This continued for at least 2 weeks. Every day we felt more and more like we were being watched, even hunted. We would see the car at all hours of the day, even noticing them around midnight. Just sitting there at the top of our drive. However, one day they didn't turn up and then finally the car just stopped showing up altogether. We never saw it again or the people who drove it. But it left the family scared for a good few months. After this experience I stopped my research. Me and Craig drifted apart, and I got into what I deemed safer hobbies. I cannot be sure what started these events and I don't know if this had anything to do with my email, it may just have been a coincidence in timing. It did however feel sinister in nature and that fear has stuck. That knowing you are being watched and not feeling safe in your own home has lasted with me for some time. As I stated before, I know this sounds untrue, I swear it is, and I cannot stress that enough. Thank you for taking the time to read this, and if anyone has had any experiences similar to mine then please let me know. I suppose I should end it like this then. Whoever you were in that dark green car, stay away from me and my family, and let's never meet again. Well, that's all I have for now. So did you like my video? I really hope so. I'm new at this, so please come back for more. I will try to get one video a week, then as I get better and better at making great videos I will make more per week. So subscribe and hit the like button. Don't let me down. Tell me what you think down in the comments. Thanks and goodbye.